So thanks everybody so much for being here today. My name is Amelia Neptune. I'm with the League of American Bicyclists, and I'm really happy to be joined by Lou Feinberg from Dero. And we'll be talking today about short-term bike parking and the law of attraction. A couple housekeeping notes before we jump into the presentation. This is being recorded, and we'll post a copy of the recording online. And if you missed our last webinar a few months ago about long-term bike parking, we can post a link in the chat box. Sarah, I'm going to send this to you and ask you to share it with everybody. If you missed it, feel free to watch that recording later. And we'll be talking today about some of the differences between short-term and long-term bike parking. So with that, Lou, if you want to go ahead to the next slide. All right, so just a little bit of background about the League of American Bicyclists and why we're hosting a session on bike parking. The League is a nonprofit bike advocacy organization, member-led, and we're really grateful to all of our members who support the organization. And we're here to advocate for a bicycle-friendly America for everyone. And bike parking is a really important piece of that. Next slide. We advocate through better biking through a number of programs. You might be familiar with our Smart Cycling program, where we teach people, we train and certify people to teach bike safety in their own communities. We support National Bike Month and Bike to Work Day. We put out a number of reports supporting bike advocacy and making the case for better biking in communities across the country. We host the National Bike Summit every year, bringing bike advocates to Washington, D.C. to advocate to their members of Congress. And we host the benchmarking website on biking and walking data, data.bikeleague.org, which helps, again, make the case for better biking and walking. Next slide. And the program I run is the Bicycle Friendly America program. So through this program, every other year, we rank all 50 states on how bike friendly they are. And then for communities, businesses, and universities, it's an opt-in program for those entities to apply for recognition and feedback so that we can help them become more bike friendly. Next slide. And the recognition and the feedback are really both equally important in this program. Not everybody that applies gets an award. If you do get an award, we try to shower you with love and recognition for that. But regardless of award level and outcome of your application, everybody gets feedback with the goal of improving. So whether you're honorable mention or no award or platinum, the goal is to help everybody move forward. Next slide. And you can see on the screen here the criteria we look at for applicants to the BFA programs are, we refer to them as the 5 E's: engineering, encouragement, education, evaluation and planning, and equity, diversity, and inclusion. Next slide. And that final E of equity, diversity, and inclusion became an official 5th E last year. And we've had equity-related questions throughout the application for a number of years. And I like to include this slide. This image is from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and it's a really important one to emphasize that not every solution solves the problems for every potential bicyclist in your community. And it's really important to make sure you have the appropriate investments to make up for previous disinvestment or breaking down barriers that exist for some members of your community that don't exist in others. So taking equity into consideration and not mistaking it for just equality, but intentional investments to bring everybody up and give everybody the resources they need to choose to bike. Next slide. And with that, I will turn it over to Lou to set us up for today.
Hey, thank you so much, Amelia. And such a pleasure to present this with you. We're going to present it together, and we'll each be chiming in as the presentation flows. So my name's Lou Feinberg. I'm with Dero Bike Racks. I've been with Dero for, gosh, 8 years now. And I work very closely with bike advocates. I come from the advocacy world. I helped start Bike Pittsburgh many years ago. And we had a bike rack program that eventually led me to this work. That seemed to be one of the things that I was putting a lot of my time and energy in. And so I made that a full-time job. And so here I am, and so happy to be here with everyone today. So we're going to we'll review the learning objectives first here. And the first one By the end of this presentation, you should know the basic features of a highly functional bike rack. Understand key considerations for site selection and avoid the dreaded forgotten bike rack syndrome. Learn how the bike rack is more than just pure utility. These babies can really fly if you let them. So you have to think kind of expansive here. And then master the art of bike rack law of attraction. Matching the right bike rack to the right location attracts bikes. And we'll go on to these nuances. I think this presentation, I hope, my hope is that it really has something for everyone. For many of you, much of the stuff might be a review, but of course, some of it, we hope at least there'll be some tidbits that'll be new to you that you'll be able to take home and will help you make better decisions about bike parking in your communities, short term, obviously, in particular. And then lastly, as a bonus, we'll briefly get into common guidelines, obstacles, innovations related to short-term bike parking, and pull out a crystal ball to predict its future. And mainly we'll use the time to percolate questions to learn what's been vexing you about the topic. So you will have an opportunity to ask us questions, and hopefully we'll get to answer all of them. And if not, maybe we'll find a way to follow up with you with the ones that maybe don't get answered today. So let's start with what makes a good bike rack, a good basic bike rack. And what creates that love bond between a bike and the bike rack? Stability of the rack. You need a bike rack that is stable, that is firmly fixed into the ground. Too often you'll go hit a bike rack out in the field, and sometimes it's not even attached to the ground that firmly. And so that's number one, whether it's, and we'll talk about hardware later, but whether it's in-ground mounted or surface mounted or on rails, stability of that rack is vital to its security. Another major and important theme is that the bike should touch the rack in 2 points of contact. That gives stability for that connection. Also, it gives you an opportunity to lock the bike in in several different locations. Because just if you can only lock a wheel, for example, then the whole front frame is vulnerable to theft, or you just lock a wheel, then someone could possibly take the frame. So having that 2 points of contact in the event that you're in a space that is vulnerable to theft, that's really, really important. And also just for the stability of the bike itself. Also for short term in particular, and really any bike parking, but security and ease of use. Even though it's short term and we don't necessarily have a lot of the protocols in place that we get for long term bike parking, like key fob, because that actually makes an impediment for short term bike parking, we still want to put security measures in, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that, what that looks like. Also for short term bike parking, we want it to be super easy to use, like almost thoughtless, like it's obvious when you look at it how you park to it, because when you get into more complicated systems that sometimes we need for long-term bike parking, people won't mess with it for short-term, and so ease of use is really very important. So how do we attract bikes for the short term, and why is that even an issue? What is this idea? Maybe I'm just sensitive to it, but I see so many bike racks out there that are just lonely, that don't ever have any bikes around them. Here's some examples. This is outside the court. I'm from Pittsburgh, so a lot of these pictures are in Pittsburgh, but these are all over the country, these kinds of pictures. Here's some bike racks outside of a courthouse in Pittsburgh. These have just sat there to rust for 15 years. I don't think I've ever seen a bike parked next to them. That's my bike next to the dumpster there. I did it there for a prop, but I don't think anyone's ever parked next to that bike behind a yoga studio. And then this bottom picture here, this is one of my prize photos, because I had some urban planners. They locally nice folks and awesome people. They do some really great urban planning, and they put bike racks in this parking lot, and they asked me what I thought, and I said, well, this is really, I have one expertise, and it's bike parking. That's it. That's all I really know. That's all I have to share. And I said to them, you're not going to get anyone to park in that parking lot. It's too removed from the businesses, and I tried to be polite about it. And they said, oh, no, people park there. I've never seen a bike parked in this parking lot that is removed from the business district this far. So, this is the idea. We want to conquer this. We want to make sure when we get short-term bike parking, we're putting in a place that people are going to park and that they're going to use racks that we're utilizing. So first,
and if I can
Go ahead, go ahead.
Sorry, if I can jump in, just looking at those photos, I would encourage the, developers or building managers of those places to think about what message they're sending to bicyclists. And it's not "you're welcome here." It's very much you're a little bit of an afterthought, and here's somewhere to lock to, but you were not anywhere close to our first thought when we planned this. And so how welcoming it is and attractive it is really does matter, and sends a message to people when they're deciding whether or not to bike to a destination.
Yep, that's exactly right. So what is considered short-term bike parking? The Association for Bicycle Pedestrian Professionals, APBP, they came up with a solution, and I think it's a great one, is that anything less than 2 hours is really short-term bike parking. Anything more than that would be long-term bike parking. So our focus today, of course, is short-term bike parking. Anything less than 2 hours, those short trips when you're going to a coffee shop or the bank or going to a class, just running a short errand, a grocery store, these are all good examples of short-term uses. So back to what Amelia just said. Do you want to have an amenity there? Do you want to have something that meets the requirement, or do you want to have something that's useless? And that's exactly, bike parking in the short term, it's just not as obvious and easy as people think, because too often folks that are installing these racks are creating situations that people don't even care to use them. And so we want to create a space that not only is a place to park a bike, but look at the amenity. I mean, just adding some paint to it, having the bikes in a certain way, making sure that, once again, 2 points of contact with the bicycle, that's a huge difference. And that says a whole lot more than, of course, what the requirement here says. And, that bike rack at the end there, the useless one, that no one's going to park there. So that's the grand difference here that we'll be really focusing on. So selecting a site for short-term bike parking. What's key is that it's convenient to use, that it's close to where people are going, and then once again, it's ease of use. These are the highest priorities. If you can't meet these priorities for short-term bike parking, that it's convenient and that it's easy to use, people just won't use it. And those are the primary checkpoints you have to use. There's other things that are important as well, but I want us to think of those as the primary ones. It has to be convenient, and it has to be easy to use. And it's really valuable to have those 2 points of contact with the bicycle, so people can feel confident that they can securely lock to it and that the bike rack is secure. So where are people currently parking their bikes when there's no racks available? That's a really great clue. Look around where people just naturally want to park their bikes. It's really a conversation with the public. You can't just determine where you want people to park because they're going to ignore you unless you're really listening to them in some way or another. And of course, you're not going to go interview everyone who might park where you want them to park. So you take a clue by, well, where are they parking already? And so how can we navigate that space and create a space nearby that will be convenient enough that they'll want to park there, but not too far that they'll just ignore where we want them to park. I worked with a local university here, and they purchased a bunch of hanger racks from us, and they wanted to put them where they wanted to put them. And I tried to explain that, well, people aren't going to park there. They're actually going to park, where they're already currently parking. So you have to find a little niche in that space for bicyclists. And they were convinced that, no, they were going to buy those racks and they were going to put them where they wanted, and bicyclists were going to park there. And of course, just the opposite happened. So, it's not just us as the people maybe installing the bike racks or the users of bike parking deciding where the bikes get parked. It's really a dialogue. And this is one of the best ways for us to pay attention to people. So we talked about convenience and ease of use, but also it has to be secure. So you need those 2 points of contact so people can put multiple locks on it if they want. But also, instead of having maybe a key fob or other security measures in place, really for short-term bike parking, one of the most important security factors are eyes on the street. You know what? And in Jane Jacobs' favorite book about the urban environment, she pointed that out many years ago. That's what helps keep places secure, really, is that they're in prominent locations where there's going to be a lot of people. And so that really helps secure our bike racks as well. is that people are watching, people are nearby, and even though they may not even intend to be the watch guards of our bikes, it's less likely someone's going to blatantly steal a bike when there's lots of eyes on the street. So picking a highly visible, prominent location is really important. And then, that gets into access and where bike parking is and how available it is by visually. So I think Amelia, you have a little story you'd like to share with us.
Yeah, so these are screenshots from two REI websites on the sort of visit us, our location pages. And running the Bicycle Friendly Business Program, I've made a habit out of checking the visit us page of any business that applies. And our feedback to them often includes a line saying, add your bike parking information to your website, because when people are making the decision of whether or not to bike to your destination, or if they're definitely biking and they're deciding whether or not to go to your destination, knowing in advance where the bike parking is, whether or not it's secure, safe, visible, all of these things that Laura is talking about, that really matters to people making that decision. And so I love these two examples because it's a photo. You can see exactly how good the bike racks are, where they are, where to find them. And that kind of visual cue on the website front and center just makes a really big difference. And as local bike advocates, if you're not a business owner on the webinar today, but you have businesses that you visit, I've also made a point to start clicking that contact us button on every business that I go to that doesn't have it on their website, that I made a decision whether or not to bike to their business, to let them know, hey, if you add information on your website about bike parking, I might actually bike to your business a lot more often. And I noticed you have some good bike parking that you don't make prominent. You have great instructions on how to drive to your business, but how about making it more obvious to people how to bike to your business? So that's just a plug to consider the website for local businesses and how they can help make a difference to elevate that bike parking in the eyes of everybody who's making the choice whether or not to go there by bike.
So let's talk about styles, bike rack styles for the short term. There's clearly bike racks that are, could be used for long term and short term. And then there's bike racks that are really best for just long term. So we're going to focus today on bike racks that are really the best for short term bike parking. And we're going to give several different examples and settings where they make sense the most. So let's talk about just a good basic bike rack. Any of these, you've probably all seen these bike racks out in the field. They all have slightly different purposes, actually, when you see racks like this. And there's racks like them that have slightly different purposes that we will go into detail about and touch on later. But just since we're on this page, we have, of course, the basic hoop rack that you see here on the far left. We also have on the bottom here, we have something that looks like maybe a basic hoop rack. It's a squared rack. We call it a downtown rack. That actually offers a little more security because of the square tubing. It's not as easy to cut with like plumber tools or something like that. So if you're looking for something that's a little more secure, unfortunately, I've seen enough bike racks, usually the tubular type, that are cut in the field. So if security is an issue, that's something you might want to consider. And then on the top right here, you see a hitch and post bike rack. As you can see, the hitch gives you that 2 points of contact we want. And the great thing about it, it's such a small profile footprint that it takes up less space than other bike racks. So that if space is an issue or you want to create a more compact space, and it's a good looking bike rack as well. It's a modern day place to, to tie up your steel horse, I guess, or steel pony. So it's a nod to the past as well. And then lastly, we can get into some still basic designs, but nice and a little more creative designs, like these arc and these round racks that you see sort of in the top center of this. These are all still very basic, run-of-the-mill bike racks, but they have different variety, and there's a lot more to that as well. A lot more options, but I think these are some good basic options for us to consider. Then, another thing to think about is when I mentioned early on in those learning objectives, these babies can fly. I'm just really impressed with how bike racks, can help identify an area or a business district or a city And they can go a long way in being far more than utilitarian, but they can really add an element of even excitement and wow to a space. Look at this great bike parking outside a baseball park, or right near Co-op, all these carrots. And then this neighborhood on the north side, branding all these bike racks in both a galvanized and powder coat color to really make them pop and really help people feel like that's a real sense of place, that neighborhood. And they have, a number of those bike racks throughout the district. The bicycle looking bike rack also, it's fun. It's fanciful, and these are the things that make people smile. And if that's what we can do that too with a bike rack. We have to remember that it has to remain functional. It has to have those 2 points of contact that we can lock to a bike, that it's still stable, but we still can have a lot of fun and do interesting stuff with custom racks. Bike corrals, that's another more and more common form of short-term bike parking. And that's for the cities that are fortunate to have them, they obviously, I think most of you know, and of course many of you may not, is that taking over a parking space in a business district and then adding any variety racks, but multiples of them, so that you can get anywhere between maybe 8 or 10 bicycles parked where you get one car parked. And here's just an example of some different bike corrals in different parts of the country. I know in Pittsburgh, in order to get a bike corral, it can be a lot more challenging of a process than just getting a bike rack on a sidewalk. Obviously, sometimes the state even has to get involved depending on who controls that road. In our case, it was a business owner that really, not the advocates, although we supported the business owner, but he opened a cafe bar on Pittsburgh South Side, and he became the champion. We got our first bike corral through primarily his efforts, and we'd supported him. So wherever you're coming from, whether you're a business owner, you're a planner, maybe you're a bike advocate, you have to find allies and work together to make things like bike corrals happen. And we'll talk a little more about them later and what they lend to neighborhoods and communities. And here's just some examples of maybe common and uncommon bike racks that frankly aren't good. And they have varying degrees of not good, but these ones, the toaster rack on the bottom here, that's just an awful bike rack, and they're never even used properly. A toaster rack because all you can fit is basically a tire in what looks like a slot for a piece of toast, and they're not good for your tires either. And that's unfortunately all too common today. These are more like crowd control mechanisms, and we really want to avoid those. And then I don't these things on the left, these like cement slats dug out for wheels. That's not a great place to park either. Obviously, not good for the bike. And it doesn't give you a whole lot of options to lock to the frame. Here's a unique looking bike rack in the top right, but once again, there's not 2 points of contact with the bicycle there, and that's problematic. And clearly people aren't parking there like the manufacturer intended them to park there, so it really defeats the purpose. Lastly, that bike rack in the middle, a lot of manufacturers offer this kind of bike rack. It's still very common. I don't think it's going away anytime soon. It goes by many different names. And it's not an awful bike rack. I wouldn't put it in the category of the other three we just mentioned. But the thing is that it'll claim to park 3 or 4 bikes. And this is how people end up parking there, because they want to, once again, have those 2 points of contact with their bike. And that's how they'll end up parking. So the amount of parking spaces that it indicates, frequently people don't use it that way. And when they use it that way, what happens is it ends up being only 1 point of contact with the bicycle. So often what can happen is the bike is almost unrolling and it's not stable against the rack. And what happens is it can end up being strewn, the bike, all over the place, like you see here in the top right. So that rack doesn't usually function like we want it to function. So those are really some of the primary examples of bad streetscape racks to keep in mind of. I want to make a special case for the hanger type style racks. There's a variety of these types of racks. APBP recommends against them. I think they can be good racks. I've seen them used well out in the field. I do want to draw a distinction between what I think are good qualities for these racks and ones that are not quite as good. And I would say things to look out for, because I think this is a good rack, and I think if this is a good solution for you, it should be complemented by at least one standalone rack. Because if someone has maybe a strangely shaped bicycle, cargo bike, or a trike, a bike that's not common, they need the space to be able to park a bike that's unique. So if you have a rack like this, always have one or two extra bike racks that are standalone by themselves that people can park, those more, anomaly type bicycles. But when if you're considering a rack like this, a hanger rack, you want maybe a hanger rack with 4 sides instead of 3. That gives more locking options. And you want to make sure there's a lot of space between the hangers so that you can definitely get a bike between each one, and that they're not too crowded and cramped. And so that picture on the left side, those hangers are really close to each other. And so they're not giving the bikes a lot of space, and the bikes might start digging into each other. And it just, you want to give bicyclists space. And so when you have more space between each of the hangers, that's what it does for you. And when you have the 4 sides instead of the 3, that also gives you more locking options. So my main point here is these can be good racks, but make sure you get one that have thought things out a little more and are providing enough space to lock to it and in between the bicycles. And when you do provide this kind of bike parking, that you have additional standalone bike parking with plenty of space for uniquely shaped bicycles. So now that we went over some of the most basic styles and ideas for more exciting styles as well, there's so many choices when it comes to bike racks. You have to think more about, what kind of finish, what kind of hardwares make sense for that bike rack. So let's talk about these kinds of things for a little bit as well. So for short-term bike racks, the main mounting options are in-ground, embedded there right in concrete. That's the most secure bike installation you're going to have. It's firmly implanted in the concrete. You can pour that with new concrete. You can dig out, you can bore out holes to put it in existing concrete. And the advantage of that, once again, super secure. The bike rack's really stable. But of course, it's pretty permanent. I mean, you have to dig and break up that concrete if you want to remove the bike rack, and that's something to consider. And you may not want something that permanent. The most common option is the surface-mounted bike rack. That's always in concrete, really. There's no other surface that works well with surface-mounted bike racks. People try to use it with asphalt, and asphalt is just such a. It's a very fluid sort of material. So when the sun's baking on it, you have to really dig deep and find good epoxies and specific hardware for that use. I'd recommend moving to a rail when you start working with pavers and asphalt. You really want to work with something that isn't as temperamental and once again, that changes its characteristics when things, like when sunshine hits it during a hot day, because that rack's going to become really unstable. The surface-mounted bike rack, once again, in concrete with wedge anchors, that's a really stable option as well. But it's a little more vulnerable to theft. So we'll talk a little bit about different kinds of hardware you can use for that. And of course,
can I jump in here too?
Sure, please do.
Sorry. So something else to consider with these options is one of the benefits of racks on rails is that if you can move them. So if you're going to have construction in a couple years and you need racks in the meantime that might need to move from one side of the building to the other. I experienced this when I worked on a campus, and it became really important because the in-ground racks, we had to completely replace them when construction took over the spot where they used to be. And racks on rails, we were able to, reattach them to different places and make sure they were secure. So, an individual couldn't move them, but campus, staff were able to pick them up and replace them when construction or other obstructions made that necessary. So that's something to consider too if you're bike parking is really in a permanent location or in a location that might need to be a little bit flexible depending on what else is going on around your location. And again, that's more common for campuses, but could be for larger businesses and cities as well.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Amelia. The other thing to consider with that is, these racks on rails, usually you need a minimum of 3 bike racks on them, anyway up to 5 or 6. Once you start getting beyond 6 bicycles, it's, to ship something like that can become cost prohibitive, especially. But, a 3-rail bike rack versus a 5-rail bike rack, there's a big weight difference there. And sometimes that's to your advantage, actually, because, if there's no bikes parked at a 3-rail bike rack, it could be just lifted unless you've anchored it to the ground. And there's opportunities to do that. I'm not saying that's common, but, the more weight can give you a little more security as well. Hardware options. There's all kinds of hardware out there. There's spikes, there's wedge anchors, there's Titan bolts for asphalt. You just have to decide what security needs you have, and what you may have to pay a little extra if you need extra secure bolts. But these Titan anchors at the very bottom, no, they're not Titan, I'm sorry. These anchors here on the very bottom left, those are spikes, concrete spikes. Those, once they're nailed into the surface, I mean, they're really hard to remove. I think they're required in Chicago. And then you can get into other kinds of anchors with proprietary tools that you perhaps, like the one right next to the spike is a proprietary tool that you could even get into, and that's a possibility as well. So when you're purchasing bike racks and you think that's an issue, that's something you want to talk about with the manufacturer, what kind of options they have available. And if they don't, there might be something at your local hardware store too that might work for you. But it's something to keep in mind as, if security is an issue. Something I did here, we had a basic wedge anchor, and we were finding some racks. It was actually, there was a, I don't know, like in 2008, right before the financial crisis, there was actually a big increase in steel prices, much like there was recently. And we started to see steel racks being lifted, or actually it was grates from like sewer grates were being lifted. People were stealing to, fortunately, we haven't seen that recently. But so we went out and took a sledgehammer to the anchors on the bike racks, and that certainly prevented people from easily being able to take them off. So, I mean, that's a very drastic thing, but that's something you can do as well as an option if you want to, prevent theft. So, finish options for the bike racks. Powder coat's very common. And that's a great option, especially if you want to match some colors or you want some vibrancy to the bike racks, colors that will really pop, or you just want to match a theme. Galvanized is a good option as well. Very frequently, they're cost competitive with one another. Galvanized will weather better over time. I've seen some powder coat do very well, but anytime you get a lot of salt, wintry conditions, or locations near the ocean, they may not hold up as well as the galvanized racks. It just really depends what you're looking for. The powder coat is more vulnerable to scratching. Of course, it might need some touch up, but it does hold up pretty well. But once again, if you're really, the most important thing is the longevity and the appearance of that bike rack, in that, it's no frills, then galvanized, that might be the option for you. Stainless is another common option. I would say maybe not common because it can be 4 and 5 times more expensive, but it's really a sharp looking option. It's really wonderfully weather resistant as well. And if you have it in your budget, that could be a way to go. And most standard bike racks, most bike racks are offered in that finish as well, if your budget allows. So in terms of short-term bike parking, we should also talk a little bit about the amenities that are associated also with short-term bike parking. Things like bike repair can really sort of upgrade an area where you're encouraging people to park their bike. And, in the event they need to do a quick, tube replacement, or they need to pump up their tires, or maybe a seat adjustment, that might be something that people will like. It's a real eye catcher, lends itself to the space. Lighting, short-term bike parking, not necessarily as important as long-term bike parking, but still very valuable. And anytime you can add lighting to a short-term bike parking space, one that maybe is a little more removed, especially, highly recommended, and something to keep in mind. Signage is something I also strongly recommend. Signage does so much for a bike parking location. You're actually sort of helping promote biking in many ways when you have signage. Hey, this is where our bike parking is. It gets people to that space, lets them know it's there, and it's a reminder that I can ride my bike here. And isn't that a lot better to look at than a bunch of street signs? Something about it warms my heart. I would imagine most people on this call too. To see signs like that's fantastic. So those are some, I think, good amenities to add to short-term bike parking. Another thing to talk about, I think lighting lends itself to this, is security. Signs, letting people know, yeah, sure, you're locking at your own risk, but guess what? This camera, this facility is under surveillance. That's a great, whether or not you even have cameras, I'd get a sign like that. It definitely persuades people to maybe think twice before they would think to steal a bike rack there. So just having a sign there is effective. It really is very effective. You can actually add security measures on the bike rack. There's manufacturers now that actually have locking mechanisms on the bike rack, and that's another level of security as well. And Amelia, I think you have a actually story from the field you want to share with us on this topic.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite details from a recent bicycle-friendly business application. So this is Brokerage Brew Company in Indiana, and they have a live stream video on their website of their bike rack, so that any patron who's parked their bike can keep an eye on their bike on their phone through the website. So anybody can check the website anytime, and they have great racks to begin with. It's in a good location, closest spot to the front entrance. But I love this extra measure of not just having a camera, but of having the live stream available on their website, so that anybody who might be nervous about their bike can rest assured and keep an eye on it while they're inside. I just thought that was a fun detail that I hadn't seen at other businesses that I wanted to encourage others to think about.
Yeah, that's great. So now that we've picked some styles, we know about some amenities, time to make sure that we don't have any lonely bike racks out there. And we're going to play matchmaker, introducing the right rack to the right space. And so here's different scenarios for different types of short-term bike parking. The streetscape, right in front of businesses, on the sidewalk. I mentioned some good basic bike racks earlier. Here's examples of them right on the streetscape. These really function well. These are good examples of just the kind of basic and not so basic bike racks to put right on the streetscape. I'd say another one would be, thinking about another setting would be campuses, colleges, in front of companies, in front of sports venues, concert venues. You want to think about spaces where you're probably going to attract more than just one or two people, but lots of people for short periods of time. What kind of bike racks do you use? Well, racks on rails works really well, or a succession of basic streetscape racks works really well too. Something like a more highly functional campus rack could work really well too. So anytime you're attracting many visitors to one place in the short term, they want a convenient location near the entrance of the place they're going, lots of people. These are the kinds of solutions that would work. Racks on rails, a succession of streetscape racks, one after the other, and also and some variety of a hanger rack. If it's the functional types, that would really work well as well also. So and remember, they have to be near entrances to where you expect people to go. That's super important. We have an example here of a campus. of the company Keen that were also applicants of the Bike Friendly Business Program. And Amelia, tell us more about this, their setup and what they did.
Yeah, so I love this example because this is the Keen headquarters in Portland, Oregon. So, you know, there's a large sort of office building where all of their headquarters staff work, but there's also their flagship storefront. And the employees who are there for 8 hours a day need the secure long-term indoor bike parking that you see on the left. And some of my favorite details from this include the hanging racks. If you look closely, those are rubber shoe soles, sort of extra soles left over from their shoe manufacturer, and Keen is a shoe company if you're not familiar with them. But then for all of their customers who are coming to the Keen garage, the flagship store, they need really visible front and center bike racks outside. So this is a perfect example of really great high quality short-term bike parking and long-term bike parking, recognizing that they have two different audiences at this one location and they need to accommodate both with the appropriate kinds of racks. So any kind of setting like this, a large company with a public facing component and the employees, or a campus where you have students moving from class to class and employees staying at the same building all day, think about the long-term and the short-term bike parking needs of all of your audiences and make sure you're providing both to those appropriate audiences.
So another common setting for bike parking, I think we're going to see this increase over time. More and more parking garage operators are recognizing that they have to afford space for bicycles, and some begrudgingly, but most, at least the ones I've run into, are, you know, recognize that this is part of an audience base for them, and sometimes they'll charge for, you know, for stored bike parking, but they'll also lend some open access public bike parking as well for people that are going to be there in the short term. On the right there, you see a bike parking facility we have here in Pittsburgh, and it's actually made out to be Space Invaders because they took over some car parking spaces. And so behind the gate is actually paid lease parking spaces at about $100 a year, I believe. But out in front, you have free, open to the public bike parking as well. And this is under surveillance by a security guard. And the space is super brightened by the tiles. That's a really great upgrade for this bike parking location. And then here you have another parking garage. Now, vertical bike racks for short-term bike parking isn't the best solution, but in this case, this is what it's fine though, and it works. It's a decent option, and it's right there in the open near the entrance to the parking garage. They didn't have space necessarily for horizontal racks, so they're offering some vertical racks in that case. And in this case, it works just fine. They're not, you know, if it was a long-term bike parking scene, people parking for the long term might utilize this as well. But when we get into the long term, people usually want that facility protected, maybe, you know, protected with a gate or some sort of safety security mechanism that controls who's in and out of that space. So this is definitely more of a short-term example in a parking garage. Another related example would be bike stations at transportation hubs or near universities, places where that are centrally located, where maybe other forms of transportation are coming in and out of, that people might park here with their bicycle and try to hop on a bus, or maybe it's a central location in the downtown that people want to drop their bike and then maneuver more freely walking to different places. So usually a good bike station is going to offer some long-term bike parking. These old trailers you see here painted in green, they actually are another actually lease space for about $125 a year. And last time I checked, all these spaces were full. But then they're also complemented with sheltered under the canopy short-term bike parking. Some of it is vertical because, once again, whatever the team that did this chose that, I don't know for sure, but they wanted to give different options. But they definitely offer some horizontal there as well, bike racks as well. So that's a nice mix. I love that they have shelter there, which is so important, even in the short term. If you can provide short-term shelter for short-term bike racks, being parked, that's such a huge bonus. Even though it's not the highest priority, if you can offer it, really valuable. This is also a mural painted on the side of a actually historical building. So I think the owner of that building has made a huge commitment here. They've called out this space. They've made it fun. They've made it pop. Really good example of a bike station offering long and short-term bike parking with a combination of vertical and horizontal racks, making sure you at least have some horizontal racks. Parks and trails, here's some different examples, a little fun, a little more fun perhaps. Events and bike valet, you know, various cities actually require a valet bike parking. San Francisco and Vermont come to mind, where if you have events, you need to have, they're required. So if you're working on an ordinance, that's something you might want to look into. Time's flown a little faster than I thought, but we have shelters as well. Shelters are super important. I just mentioned it. If you can provide shelters in the short term, that's fantastic. Amelia, do you have anything to add to this one?
Yeah, I'd just say the photo on the left, something I really appreciate about this one. This is from Boise State University, which is a gold level bicycle friendly university. And this is a sort of sandwich board showing people how to use these vertical bike racks. Because as Lou said, they're not necessarily the best, you know, in terms of how intuitive they are, and in terms of people, you know, being able to easily use them. So having some additional information here, I thought was just a really lovely way to say, you know, hey, bicyclist, you're using this for the first time. Here's how you securely lock your bike. And then again, you know, both of those, all of these pictures show sheltered bike parking, short-term bike parking, which, you know, is something that I think a lot of people think if it's short-term, you don't need shelter. But in fact, you know, whether it's rain or snow or in hotter climates, you know, having a blazing hot sun with your saddle in the heat all day, a little bit of shade can go a long way to make your ride home a lot more comfortable. So it's not just rain, but you know, shelter from all the elements, I think, is really important to consider even for short-term bike parking. Yeah, and you know, you don't always need to build a shelter. You just find a location in campus where there's an overhang where you can put the bike racks. And then space use. Remember, all these bike racks all park 2 bikes, but look at the different space that they take up. And so if you're under space constraints or you have no space constraint, just remember that the style of the bike rack, the functionality may be the same, but the amount of space it takes up can be incredibly different. Speaking of space, I want to talk briefly about ADA considerations. This is important as well. There's 2 main things to consider with bike racks and ADA. One is protruding objects and post-mounted objects. When we talk about short-term bike parking, we're mainly concerned with post-mounted objects because that's the kind of fixtures we see out on the street. They're not usually hanging from walls. They're more often than not, they're post-mounted. And examples of that would be like maintenance stations like we see here, or elongated hoop racks. These are all sort of post-mounted. And if they extend more than 12 inches, and they're above 27 inches out of the cane sweep, then a really good strategy is to put what we call a lean bar so that it's within the cane sweep and that they're easily spottable between the posts. Because if you're, once again, if you're extending more than 12 inches, you need something indicating that in fact there's an object above that might be a hazard. And so that is post-mounted objects. If it's more than 12 inches from the post itself, it needs to have some indication. In this case, we're using these lean bars until you come to this other post, and then that's another indication for the cane sweep. And then, you know, it's really about inclusivity, not only for maybe the visually impaired, but also we have here's a kid's bike rack. And so I think that's a really fun example of inclusivity with bike parking as well. Amelia, share with us this example at Target and the steps they've taken to make it easily accessible and for parking a variety of different bicycles. Yeah, so thank you to Bike Arlington for posting these pictures on Twitter. I just love them. This is the Target store in Ballston in Arlington, Virginia. And in their parking garage, the very closest parking spots to the door are cargo bike parking, and they're clearly labeled as such. And, you know, these are standard U racks, but they're spaced appropriately so that larger cargo bikes, adaptive bikes, recumbents, you know, any sort of unusually sized bike away from the standard bike size could fit here. And at a shopping center, it's appropriate for them to encourage cargo bike parking so that, you know, you can load up your haul and fit even more on the ride home. But I just love this example, and I hope that more places start to consider this. You know, just the simple act of how you space your bike racks really changes how accessible they are. And, you know, this example especially, you know, as I put here, it's got the shelter, it's got the access, and it's got the security by being inside in the parking lot, in the parking garage, excuse me, and right next to the front entrance to the store. So, you know, it's an urban setting store. Not every Target has their car parking inside, but I thought it was a great example of accommodating bikes in a really great way.
Yeah, that is a fantastic example. And so when we're thinking about things like ADA, the American Disabilities Act, we're both thinking about, we don't want bike racks to be an impediment to people who are visually impaired, but we also want to create the space for people who actually ride their bikes. I met a guy this past week at a conference who carried his wheelchair on his bicycle. So when he arrived with his trike, or he actually hand pedaled, when he arrived to his destination with his hand pedal bike, he then could take his wheelchair and go where he needed to go. And so that's really a question of space. Like Amelia said, you got to create the space. And that's the best thing you can do for ADA. The bike rack's not necessarily designed for it, right? It's really about the space that's designed. So some requirements and obstacles. Usually in ordinances and permits, there's usually design standards. Make sure you're meeting design standards for your city. If they have them when you're putting bike racks in, that it meets it. They often have spacing requirements. Sometimes there's a minimum in certain jurisdictions, minimums requirements. San Francisco comes to mind, and when a new building's being built and the builder doesn't necessarily want to put the bike racks there, they can actually pay into a fund to the city so that the city has the money to then put short-term bike racking in the vicinity or near the building. Usually also some things that you might have to consider are encroachment fees, permitting fees. Sometimes there's questions of liabilities when you place bike racks. Sometimes you have to have property owners sign off on them. These were all actually obstacles I faced early on in Pittsburgh, and I'm going back a while, like 15 years. And so my sense is a lot of cities have this figured out by now, but some don't. And so these are some of the obstacles that you might find yourself running into, and just be familiar with them and let it you know, and feel confident that you can overcome them, because eventually if your city's having these issues, you know, feel free to get in touch with me or Amelia. We'll be happy to help you think about these and how to overcome these obstacles if you're still being constrained by them in your town. How to increase short-term bike parking where you live. Great bike rack programs like cost share programs like Minneapolis has, where you can sign up and the business actually pays for half the rack and the city covers the other half. Some of these programs just pay for the racks if you sign up for them, and there's a certain amount every year. So check with your city if they're not doing them. How can you help them do a program like that? You know, maybe it's required in the ordinance for it to happen, like we just mentioned. If you're replacing meters for the new kiosks that are happening all over cities, maybe use those meters for meter replacement. There's products out there that you can put posts on the meters to park bikes, because that's often a great place to park a bike. And if they're being taken away, you have to find a quick and easy solution. And so there are products out there, once again, that can fit on an old meter and create a post so you have a bike rack there. Another thing to consider is if you can find a foundation or someone who's willing to donate money to buy bike racks, I recommend donating those bike racks to the city. Don't deal with all the paperwork. Don't deal with all the headaches and try to figure it out. Say, hey, I've got money. I'm going to donate 10 bike racks to the city for you to put out in the city streets. And usually they're pretty receptive to it. And it's a really great way, once again, for you not to have to deal with some of that paperwork and that red tape that sometimes you have to deal with bike racks. Amelia, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that's great. And just in the interest of time, I'll let people know that this webinar is supposed to go to 4:15 Eastern time, so we will have some time for Q&A at the end, and we just have a couple more slides now. So thanks everybody for hanging on.
So in terms of looking ahead to the future, gosh, with short-term bike parking, I think we can all, there's something about it that's so basic, and it shouldn't be we shouldn't be overthinking it. So in some ways, maybe it won't change much at all. But I do anticipate seeing more shelters. In other words, just more and more people don't just want to let their bikes being hit by the elements. And so when it's possible, I see more, we'll see even in streetscapes, more and more shelter option and bike corrals where the bikes are actually covered. I think we're going to see continuously more and more artistic and designed forward racks that are interesting and lend themselves to spaces. More integration with the landscape and mobility hubs, just visually more interesting. More technology and charging opportunities. I think that we're seeing that now, and that's just going to continue to grow. Different types of technology in terms of people being able to plug in electric bikes, which are growing in demand, very dramatically, and solar and solar lighting, that kind of technology. Of course, if you look to Japan and Europe, you see bike elevators now, where almost like silos, people can put their bike into a system and it can be taken off to who knows where and brought back up from the underground. But those aren't really short-term scenarios. Once again, the short-term scenarios are really close to the businesses or the places where people want to go. And so, I hope looking ahead, locking to things like trees, gates, and fences or street furniture, hopefully that'll be a thing of the past. So it's really finding, carving out little niches on the street or in landscape near businesses that people want to park, and just more of the things we're doing right currently. How about you? Anything to add to that, Emilio?
I think this is great. I think more and more just places recognizing that providing bike parking is essential, and that it benefits businesses, communities, individuals, everybody. So I think just in general, bike parking, more and more bike parking is what we're seeing looking ahead.
More signage, more paint to designate these places. I think we're going to see more murals on the ground and all over the place. Art, once again, art is real important. I think adding an artistic element to your bike parking can be really valuable and make the space even brighter. And we're starting to see more and more of that. And that's a way to connect with local artists as well. Once again, the logo racks and creating local artists, having them design the bike racks. We have a great example of that in downtown Pittsburgh in our cultural district, of about 15 to 20 unique bike racks designed by local artists. What can we do to learn more about the league?
So there are some links here if people are interested, and mostly these are links pointing to the Bicycle Friendly America programs. And if you are representing a business and you're interested in applying for the Bicycle Friendly Business designation, our application is open for submissions, and the next deadline is March 2nd, 2022. So you've got a bunch of time between now and then, but you're welcome to submit early, and we'll review it after that deadline. But we also have a ton of resources on our website, including about bike parking and about sort of making the case for investments in things like bike parking. So check out our website if you're looking for more tools and resources to help your community or your business to improve. And the next slide that's a good segue to the next slide. I'll just say, Lou, you probably have more to say on this topic, but there are some really fantastic guides out there about bike parking. We share the Dero bike parking guide with all BFB awardees and their award package, but the APBP bike parking guidelines is a really fantastic resource, and that's the standard that we use on all of our BFA applications to say whether or not bike parking is good enough. I encourage everybody to familiarize yourselves with that Essentials of Bike Parking document from APBP. And it's basically all the things that Lou highlighted today about security and access, and accommodating the appropriate number of bikes, et cetera. But these are really great resources, and we can put some more links in the chat to help you find all of these things online. So I'll put them in and let Sarah copy them over. Lou, do you have anything to add to that?
No, these are all great resources. Feel free. I just want to share my email. It's lou@dero.com. It's very basic, very simple, lou@dero.com. Feel free to send me any emails or questions you may have. Feedback too. I'd love to hear anything you thought about this presentation. and be more than happy to answer any of your questions. And we can get you copies of these guides too. So just let me know. So I don't, Amelia, what's your email, by the way, Amelia? I don't know if we saw it on here.
Yeah, mine is amelia@bikeleague.org, AMELIA@bikeleague.org.
Great. So we have now our time we can ask some questions, or hopefully we can answer them and ask them. So, but please, let's have time to do this now. So, Sarah, what do we got?
Yeah, hi, I'm Sarah. I work with Lou at Dero, and I've been answering quite a few of the questions in the background, but we got some great questions that came through. So one of the most recent was, with cargo bikes becoming more and more popular in the US, how should businesses and cities start to plan for their specific parking requirements to address those cargo bikes?
Go ahead, Amelia.
Yeah, so I think I'll just start out, and I'm sure you have more on the topic, but my slide with the target pictures in Arlington does a good job of showing that considerations about the rack and the space around the rack are what's most important, and e-cargo bikes are becoming more and more of a thing, and as Lou mentioned, charging for those bikes is important. I would say that's more important for long-term bike parking, but it's definitely something to think about for short-term bike parking too. And then I also think, you know, the way in those target pictures there was paint on the ground to show, you know, if that paint weren't there, the racks would just seem really far spaced out without much reason. And somebody who isn't thinking about their cargo bike or, you know, a larger framed bike might not think about that, you know, the reason for why they're so spaced out. And it might just seem like, boy, this is not the most efficient use of space if there aren't any bikes parked there at the time. So adding that additional sort of signage and paint on the ground really sets the stage to say, no, this space is here intentionally. Think about this in terms of this, you know, larger framed cargo bike that could be parked here. And hopefully soon that means more and more cargo bikes will be parked there as well. Anything to add to that, Lou?
No, I think you covered it. It's really about space and communication. You know, really, you know, always have that extra space, no matter what your layout is. Always have extra spaces for larger bikes, whatever they may be, and then communicating it. Could be with stickers, could be with paint, could be with signs. So just reiterating what Amelia said, and that should cover it. Those are really valid, you know, valuable points. And that's all it takes. Those kinds of steps.
Absolutely. So the next question starts with a comment. I would gladly pay for secure bike parking versus free where my valued bike can be stolen. Any suggestions for advocating for that with our local government?
Advocating for secured bike? Sorry, can you repeat it?
Sorry, yeah. Advocating for secured paid bike parking versus free for those who want, you know, that additional layer of security.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing there is showing that there's demand for it. So whether that's, you know, getting bicyclists, you know, to sign on to a letter or show up to a city council meeting or a BPEC meeting, that can go a really long way to say, you know, that this is something that will be used. Because often that's all it is. You need the data to make the case that's something that, you know, the city might be debating whether or not they should make that investment, showing that it will be worth it, and especially for something that's paid, you know, that there will be dividends to return on that investment. So that would be my advice. Lou, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, boy, the challenge is going to be depending on where you live. Hopefully, there's other people just like you that have the same interest, or you know, or if it's maybe a smaller market, you know, it may be an anomaly. But I do think it's so important to have that initial dialogue and just to at least bring the topic up with who's ever responsible for it, and really present it, don't be angry, but present it as an opportunity to collaborate with them, work with it, show, you know, first and foremost, okay, if they're not willing to put paid bike parking, how can they make your bike parking more secure? So, you know, there may be more than one way to go about it. And it might be some of the steps that we talked about today. Maybe lighting, maybe cameras might also help. And if it's paid and you have demand in that location, that that might be an option too. But think of a number of ways that it might make it more secure if you can't get paid for parking.
Absolutely. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, one other thing I have is just to also think about some examples you could share from other communities, and this is somewhere that I think the League could potentially help. So one example that comes to mind for me is in Santa Monica, the Bike Center is this great space that's sort of a bike shop and bike rentals and bike parking for commuters who come into downtown Santa Monica. And they've over the years been a bicycle friendly business and provided us with some really great quotes and examples of sort of how worth it's been for the city to help invest in this secure bike parking. But and I'm trying to find some exact numbers for you that I could share, but feel free to reach out to me because we do get some really good examples like this from around the country. And sometimes all it takes is showing that, hey, this has worked somewhere else. Let's try to do it here as well. So that's a good place where the League can help out.
That is a good segue into the next question. Are there any boilerplate bike parking regulations for local planning and zoning board to use as a guide?
Amelia, have any from the League?
Lou.
I was just going to ask if you guys
have.
had.
I was actually going to point to the Dero Bike Parking Guide webpage has a couple links to city bike ordinances that I think are some good examples. I don't know if you have any that stand out to you, but that's actually one area where I don't feel like I have any great examples from, at least from application data, but I know I've seen them on your website, so that's the first place that came to mind.
You know, San Francisco, Arlington, I'd look into what they have in place. They have some of the more detailed bike parking ordinances and requirements, and they I believe they do address it there. Victoria Policy Institute is something I've turned to over the years as well, and they may have some information there for you in terms of a template. Yeah, those are the main ones that come to mind. San Francisco and Arlington, I think, are really good places to start.
And I just found the link to San Francisco's main bike parking website, and I believe there's a lot of great information there, but I think you can find their actual policy linked from there as well.
And we have time for a few more questions. Besides options for charging, are there any other unique considerations for short-term e-bike parking?
I would say e-bikes are heavier than your average bike, and so making sure it's not, vertical or anything that would need to be lifted, and also taking special consideration of ramps and turning radius and that sort of thing with cargo bikes and e-bikes both, and also taking into consideration that a lot of people who are using e-bikes might be using it for adaptive reasons, and so considering those, various abilities and how bike parking can help make that, that much more accessible to people who are using e-bikes for mobility challenge reasons.
I'd add, they're off. Well, these days the prices have come down quite a bit, but just security. We've talked a little bit about ways to make things more secure, and so I think people with an e-bike are going to be even more attuned to security than people without an e-bike, even though there's obviously people invest lots in their bike, whether it's e-bike or not. But I think with an e-bike, it's even more of a pressing issue. So add some of those security measures we talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question, they're curious about the definition of convenience. You talked about making things more convenient. Does that mean right by the front door, or can you add a little bit to what the definition of convenience is?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that there's any one definition. I think visibility from the front entrance, and if you've ever paid attention to where people will lock their bikes regardless of where the bike racks are, you'll know that most bicyclists will park in what they deem the most convenient place. So going back to Lou's earlier slide about paying attention to where people are currently locking their bikes to, if you have bike racks around the corner from your entrance and everybody's locking to the tree that's right out front, that tells you that for most of your bicyclists, convenience means being right out front. And, I don't think there's any one easy answer, but I think that is the biggest thing, that sort of proximity and visibility, right front and center.
Yeah.
What about you?
I draw standards. I think for lead to get a point for lead, I believe you have to have your bike parking within 100 feet of the entrance. I'd say 50. I'd say put it 50 if you can, and no more than 100. So or less than 50. But you got to be careful. You don't want to put it too close so that you're jeopardizing, emergency first responders or something like that from entering the building. So yeah, there might be even certain parts of the building codes that don't allow you to do that. But you want convenience by and large means as close to the entrance as you can get it without making it cumbersome to people entering and leaving the building. So that's the main thing. Also, by convenience, once again, to the concept of ease of use. You don't want to put a two-tiered bike rack in that space unless you have to, because space constraints. You want to be able to just roll up and lock it. Done. That's pretty much. So those are the two main things.
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for one or two more questions. This one is for Lou specifically, and I thought it was a great question. Why do you think no one uses those bike racks that you pictured outside the courthouse, the rusty wave rack?
Those spaces, they just they're too removed from the entrance. Number one, they're also in really aesthetically unpleasing places. Like under bridge might not be bad, but it was right near I don't know. It was some kind of HVAC equipment, like right up next to it, kind of like that garbage can. It's like people don't even know what it is. They don't even necessarily know it's a bike rack. And so that's just a rusty ornament, really, is what it became. So, but really because it's too removed from the place, and whatever it's butting up against, what it's next to, is just unappealing. And that goes back again to the idea of make that space bright, give bicycles the honor they deserve. Paint them beautifully, make it fun, make it exciting. We're all we need more people on bikes, and we can talk about safety and all that, but part of that process is making it bright and fun. And any of those places that I showed you, there's nothing bright and fun about them, and I think that's a big part of it. And they're too removed, so those are reasons why.
Yeah, absolutely. One final, hopefully quick question. Going back to the slide on the bad streetscape rack, the top right corner picture has the long, tall poles. And there was a question of how do you lock your bike to those poles? And I thought that was very interesting. And obviously the people who were trying to use them had no idea because their bikes are on the ground and not locked up to the rack. So thought I would throw that one out there as a good way to wrap things up.
I'm having trouble remembering what specific rack again?
It's on the gray slide titled Bad Streetscape Racks. The top right, so that tall rectangular pole on that slide. And all it is a rectangular pole. There's no crossbar. It's just a tall rectangular metal pole. Okay.
How do people, I'm just curious. Sorry to go through this, but I can't picture.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm looking at it offline, and I would say I think the point of that image is that there isn't a great way to lock your bike to that one securely, because it's just so narrow, and you can only get one point of contact.
Yeah.
That's my take. I don't know what you think, Lou.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I think your question, it just reflects the point, right? Yeah, there's not a good way to park at this bike rack. And like Amelia just said, it doesn't have those 2 points of contact. I think we're going to see more and more of artistically designed, very sharp, very architecturally sort of minded bike racks for spaces like this. You just have to be careful that they're functional. Here's an example of one that just isn't functional at all. It doesn't have those 2 points of contact. And, I don't even doubt if you also put your hand on these racks, if they didn't wiggle in the ground, they may not even be anchored very well. Sometimes there's a problem with that. So, yeah.
Sounds good. All right.
Yeah.
So, I think that wraps up the questions and that was information. So thanks to both of you for presenting.
Absolutely. Thank you to Dero for supporting this webinar today, and thanks everybody for attending. We'll post the recording online with a copy of the slides, and are happy to answer any other questions folks have offline. And I encourage anybody who's interested in improving their business or their community for bicycling to look into the BFA program. Thanks again to Lou and Sarah for your help running this webinar today and all the great insights. And I think that's it. Have a great day, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. It was a pleasure.